Not a rumor. Not a lie someone made up to poison a neighbor's name. He walked her out in front of the whole town, tied her wrists with rope, and let strangers argue over what she was worth. She was 22 years old, her belly round with a child no one would let her keep quietly, and every face in that crowd watched without a word of protest. If you think you've heard a story about a woman surviving the worst a man could do to her, wait. You haven't heard this one yet. Stay with us until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning Elias Holloway decided to sell his daughter, he woke before the sun and made himself a full breakfast. That was what Maris remembered most years later. Not the rope, not the crowd, not the cold. She remembered hearing the skillet scrape against the iron stove from her room while she lay on her side staring at the wall, hands already bound at the wrist, because her father had tied them the night before and told her to get some sleep. He had made bacon and fried bread and had eaten at the table with the same unhurried patience he used for everything, every decision he'd ever handed down like it was scripture with no room for argument. She could smell the grease from behind the locked door. Her stomach turned. She had known for 3 days what he was planning. Old Clem Pruitt, who fixed the leather work on saddles and talked too much when he drank, had let it slip at the dry goods store. "Your daddy's putting you in the square Saturday." He'd said it low, like he was embarrassed, but he hadn't tried to stop it. Nobody had tried to stop it. That was the part she kept returning to. Not one person in Red Ash Crossing had knocked on the door and said, "Elias, this isn't right." They would all come to watch, though. That much she'd known for certain. Red Ash Crossing sat at the far edge of what polite people called civilization, a clot of maybe 200 souls pressed against the base of the Harrow Mountains, held together by a single main road, a handful of storefronts, a blacksmith, and the particular kind of desperation that made people stay in a place that gave them nothing, because leaving felt harder than enduring. The nearest town of any size was 4 days by wagon. The law was whatever the most stubborn man in the room decided it was on any given morning, and justice was a word people used mostly when talking about other people's business. Elias Holloway was not the cruelest man in Red Ash Crossing. That was almost the worst part. He was a farmer who paid his debts and kept his fences mended and occasionally brought surplus vegetables to the Widow Trask without being asked. He went to the church meetings, shook hands with the preacher, and had raised 2 children after his wife died of a fever when Maris was 7. His son, Danny, had gone east to work rail and sent money home twice a year. Maris had stayed because someone needed to cook and clean and tend the animals, and she had been 14 when her mother died, and it had simply become the shape of her life. She was not a timid girl. She had never been timid. That was another thing the town had always held against her. The way she looked men in the eye when she spoke, the way she laughed too loud sometimes, the way she pushed back when pushing back was the only honest thing to do. Her father called it stubbornness. He had been trying to beat it out of her in one form or another since she was old enough to have opinions. The pregnancy had not come from stubbornness. It had come from one of the few moments in her life that had felt like her own. A few months in the spring when a young surveyor named Thomas Cade had passed through town, stayed 3 weeks while he mapped the northern ridgeline, and had treated her like she was worth more than her usefulness. He had made her laugh. He had asked her what she thought about things and actually waited for the answer, and then he had ridden east with his equipment and his easy smile and his complete absence of intention. And she had slowly understood that she was going to be left with the evidence of her own foolishness growing inside her. She hadn't told her father who the father was. She would not tell him, not because she wanted to protect Thomas Cade. She had no feeling left for him by the time winter came, just a dull resignation. But because telling Elias would have meant letting him own that piece of her too, and she was already running low on pieces that were still hers. He had asked once, quietly. She'd said nothing. He had asked again the following week with his hand raised, and she had said nothing again, and he had hit her, and she still hadn't said anything, and something had shifted in his face. Not rage exactly, but the particular coldness of a man who has decided to stop trying and start acting. 3 days later, Clem Pruitt had told her what was coming. Chad. They walked her out at 9 in the morning. Her father didn't drag her, which almost made it worse. He opened the door and said, "Let's go," and she walked because the rope was around her wrists, but also because there was something in her that understood fighting him in the yard would only give the town a more entertaining story. If she was going to endure this, she would endure it upright. The square, really just a wide patch of packed dirt between the general store and the farrier's, already had 40 people in it when they arrived. By the time her father had led her to the platform they used for announcements and the occasional livestock sale, there were closer to 70. She recognized nearly all of them. The Pruitt family, Clem looking at his boots, the Harker brothers, both of them grinning like this was a county fair. Margaret Doss, who had once brought Maris a shawl when Maris had a cold, and who now stood in the back of the crowd with her arms crossed and her face arranged in the careful blankness of a woman who had decided not to have an opinion about this. Maris looked at Margaret for a long moment. Margaret looked away. Her father stood beside her and addressed the crowd the way he addressed everything. Without drama, without raised voice, with the flat certainty of a man who had decided he was right and saw no reason to defend it. "My daughter has disgraced this family," he said. "She refuses to name the man responsible. She refuses to leave the territory. She refuses to give the child away as a decent woman would. Since she's determined to remain a burden in this community, I'm making it someone else's burden. Any man willing to take her on gets the work she's capable of for as long as he wants it. Bidding starts at $30. Maris stood on the platform and let her eyes move across the crowd. She was looking for something. Anger, protest, one voice that would say, "You can't do this." And she found nothing. She found curiosity. She found a few men in the back already calculating. She found the Harker brothers elbowing each other. She found Clem Pruitt still studying the ground like it contained some answer he couldn't locate. She had known this would happen. She had known it in her bones for days. But knowing and standing in the middle of it turned out to be two entirely different experiences. And something that had been wound tight in her chest since she heard Clem's warning finally came uncoiled and fell into nothing. And she thought, this is what the end of hope feels like. It feels like standing in a square in front of people who know your name and discovering they are all perfectly comfortable watching. 35, said Jim Harker from the back. His brother laughed. 40, said the man who ran the livery. She stopped listening to the numbers. She stared at a fixed point above the crowd, a weather vane on the general store roof, a tin rooster with a bent tail, and she breathed slow and deliberate and tried to stay in her body, because collapsing would only give them more. The bidding moved in fits and starts, men calling numbers from different parts of the crowd, someone occasionally making a joke that got a small laugh. It was the sound of an ordinary transaction in an extraordinary morning, and it was the most degrading thing she had ever heard. At some point she realized she was shaking, not from cold, though it was cold, but from the effort of standing still while her body tried to make some kind of protest. Her mind had already surrendered. The highest bid had reached $62. Jim Harker again, louder now, enjoying himself, when the crowd shifted. She noticed it before she identified the cause. A kind of compression, people stepping back and sideways to create a path without being asked, the way water moves around something large and indifferent to it. She followed the movement back to its origin and found a man at the edge of the square. He was not immediately remarkable to look at. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, wearing a coat that had started life as brown and become something closer to the color of weathered bark. His hat was pulled low. He had a beard that had not been attended to recently, and the general appearance of someone who spent more time in wilderness than town. He walked through the crowd without looking at anyone, without asking them to move, and they moved anyway. He stopped at the base of the platform. He looked up at her father. "How much to end this?" he said. His voice was low, not threatening, just flat. The voice of someone who had already decided and was only bothering with the words as a formality. Her father frowned. "Current bid is $62. "I'll pay $100, the man said. "Cash. Right now." Auction's done. The square went quiet. Not a gradual quiet, a sudden one, like a door closing on the sound of everything outside. Maris looked down at the man from the platform. She couldn't read his face clearly with the hat in the way, just the line of his jaw and the set of his shoulders and the patient stillness of someone who had said his number and was prepared to wait as long as necessary for the answer. Her father said, "Done." She had time, in the minutes that followed, while her father collected his money and the crowd began to mutter and disperse, while someone untied the rope from the post and handed the trailing end to this stranger, to be afraid again. Not the hollow, exhausted absence of hope she'd felt on the platform, but real fear with teeth in it, because she was now the property of a man she had never seen before. And one humiliation might simply have been traded for another with worse consequences. She didn't show it. She had learned a long time ago that showing fear to men who might use it was the most expensive thing she could do. The man, she hadn't heard a name yet, came up beside her and looked at the rope around her wrists. He pulled a folding knife from his coat pocket. She made herself hold still while he cut the rope. He cut it close and careful, not the way someone does something quickly to get it over with, but the way someone cuts rope when they don't want to nick the skin underneath. The rope fell in the dirt. He did not pick up the trailing end. He did not reach for her. He stepped back and looked at her and said, "My horse is at the farrier's. You'll ride if you're willing. If you'd rather find somewhere else to go, I can leave you here." She looked at him. Up close, he was older than she'd first thought. Late 30s, maybe touching 40, with lines around his eyes that weren't from laughing and a scar along his jaw that had been a serious wound once. His eyes were a gray-green that she couldn't quite place a name to. "Where are you taking me?" she said. "Mountains," he said. "I have a cabin. You'd have a roof and food and somewhere to have that baby safely." He paused. "I'm not buying anything from you. I paid your father so he'd stop doing what he was doing. What you do after that is your business." She studied him for a long moment. He let her study him without getting impatient about it. Behind her, she heard her father's voice talking to someone. Casual, already moving on, already absorbed in whatever came next for him. The sound of it turned something cold in her chest. "All right," she said. "Mountains." His name was Garrick Voss, and he had come down from the peaks for the first time in 4 months to buy winter salt and nails and a new whetstone, and he had not intended to stay in Red Ash Crossing any longer than it took to load his horse and get back on the road north. He had heard the crowd from the main street and had gone to look out of the stubborn habit of wanting to know what was happening in a place before he had to move through it. And he had seen a young woman on a platform with her wrists tied, and he had stood there for a moment doing the kind of arithmetic that has nothing to do with numbers, and everything to do with what a person can live with. He did not tell her any of this. He helped her onto his horse, a big roan with a patient disposition named Clum, and mounted behind her and turned north out of town without looking back at the square. She didn't ask him questions at first. That surprised him. Most people who'd just been through something like that came out the other side talking, like language was the thing keeping them attached to their own body. She sat in front of him on the saddle and was quiet, and he understood after a while that she wasn't in shock. She was paying attention, tracking the road, watching the tree line, cataloging what she could see and hear, making her own inventory of this new situation with the same deliberate method she'd probably applied to every situation that had ever been handed to her, whether she wanted it or not. He respected that. They rode through the valley and into the foothills, and she still hadn't spoken when he pulled up Clum beside a stream to let the horse water. "You can ask," he said. "What's your name?" she said immediately, like she'd been saving that one. "Garrick Voss." "What do you want from me, Garrick Voss?" The directness of it almost made him smile. Almost. "Nothing," he said. "Men don't pay $100 for nothing." "I paid $100 so that auction didn't have a winner," he said. "Those aren't the same thing." She turned in the saddle to look at him. Genuinely look, not just glance. He held her gaze and didn't elaborate because he'd said the true thing, and embellishing it would only make it sound like a performance. "And if I decide I want to leave your cabin and go somewhere else," she said, "then I'll help you get where you're going if you tell me where that is." She turned back around. He could see the line of her shoulder, the set of her jaw and profile. She was wearing a coat that was too thin for the altitude they were heading toward, and her boots had a crack along the left sole that was going to let water in before the day was over. And she was visibly, substantially pregnant, and had just spent at least an hour being publicly humiliated in front of everyone she'd ever known. She sat straight as a fence post. "All right," she said again. "Keep going." The trail to Garrick's cabin was not a trail in any maintained sense. It was a series of decisions he made every time he came back. Cross the stream here, angle left past the gray rock face. Follow the tree line north until the ground rises, and then climb until the second clearing. He'd been making those decisions for 7 years, since he'd first come up here with $30, a hammer, and the particular emptiness of a man who has lost the thing that made him someone. And he'd built the cabin over 6 months working from before first light until he could no longer see his hands. Mara said nothing for the first hour of the climb. He could feel her fatigue, not from laziness, she was not lazy, but the bone-deep exhaustion of a body carrying more than it should while simultaneously carrying a child. At some point, without discussing it, she leaned back slightly, just a fraction, to rest against him, and then caught herself and straightened again. "You can lean back," he said. "I'm fine." "You've been awake since before I rode into town. You're not fine. Lean back." A pause. Then slowly, she let herself rest against him, and he felt the held tension in her spine ease, maybe by a quarter, which was probably the best she was capable of in the present circumstances, and he understood that too. "How long have you been up here?" she asked. "In the mountains." 7 years. "Alone?" "Mostly." "Why?" He thought about that. Had reasons to come up, didn't find enough reasons to go back down. She seemed to accept this as sufficient. "The town will say you took me." "The town will say what it wants." "My father will come looking. He doesn't like losing things he thinks are his, even things he was willing to sell." "I know." "That doesn't bother you?" "I've had worse things come looking for me up here," he said, bears included. He didn't elaborate on what worse things meant. She didn't ask. They rode in silence after that, and the trees thickened around them, and the air got colder and sharper, carrying that particular high country smell of pine and granite and distance that he had come to think of as the smell of something being left behind. The cabin was functional. That was the kindest word for it. It was a single room with a sleeping loft, built from the pine and spruce that had been most available when he'd started with neither skill nor money and had learned both from necessity. The walls were solid. He'd gone back over them every year, checking for weakness, plugging gaps with clay and moss. There was a fireplace that drew well, a wood stove for cooking, a table with 2 chairs, shelves along the eastern wall holding tools and supplies, and the detritus of a solitary life. A single window, south-facing, let in most of the light the room got. He watched her look at it when they came through the door. She looked at all of it, slow, methodical, cataloging. And he waited for the deflation, the small realization that she had traded one hard situation for another, only colder. She said, "Where do I sleep?" He pointed to the loft. "I'll sleep down here." "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said. "Do you want coffee? I can have fire going in 10 minutes. She looked at him again, that direct look, trying to figure out the angle. He understood it. She had been trained by experience to assume that kindness always came with an invoice, and she was waiting to find it. "Yes," she said. "Coffee. Thank you." Her name was Maris Holloway, and she was 22 years old, and she had grown up 40 miles from this mountain and had never once climbed it. And the first night in the cabin, she lay in the loft and listened to the wind moving through the trees outside and tried to make some accounting of her life so far. There was not much in the credit column. She had her health, mostly. She had her stubbornness, which had cost her significantly, but which she had no intention of surrendering. She had a child coming in, maybe 6 weeks. She'd stopped counting with complete precision because precision hadn't been helping her feel better about anything. She had a roof over her head that belonged to a stranger who claimed he wanted nothing from her, which was either the most straightforward situation she'd ever been in or the most elaborate deception, and she didn't yet have enough information to know which. She pressed her hand against the side of her belly where the baby was pushing back, steady and insistent, with no awareness of or interest in the circumstances it had been gestating through. "I know," Maris said quietly. "Me too." Downstairs she could hear Garrick moving, banking the fire, the sound of something being set on a shelf. The ordinary sounds of someone doing the ordinary things that ended a day. She had not heard that in months, someone in the same house making sounds that were just sounds. Not the sounds of anger gathering or silence that meant punishment was forming somewhere in a room she couldn't see. She did not let herself feel relieved. Relief was something that had to be earned over time, and she had not been here long enough to earn anything. But she let herself breathe, full and slow, for the first time since she couldn't remember when. That was enough for one night. In the morning, she woke to gray light and the smell of coffee and something frying, and for a moment, just a moment, the length of a breath, she didn't know where she was. And then she did, and she lay there deciding what that meant. She came down the ladder from the loft slowly, one hand on the rung and one under her belly, and found Garrick at the wood stove with his back to her, turning something in the pan with the focused quiet of a man who spent a great deal of time alone and had learned to make the routine actions of living into something like company. "There's a bucket by the door," he said without turning. "Clean water. Outhouses around back, 20 paces east." She looked at the bucket, then at him. "How did you know I was up?" "Third step from the bottom creaks," he said. "Knew that step would give me trouble when I cut the board. Never fixed it." He moved the pan off the heat. "Sit down. Eat." She sat. He put a plate in front of her. Fried salt pork, cornmeal flatbread, something that might have been dried apple rehydrated and cooked soft, and poured coffee and sat at the other side of the table with his own plate. They ate without talking for a while, which suited her. She was observing him the way she observed everything now, with the particular attention of someone who has learned that what people did when they weren't performing for anyone was the truest version of them available. He ate without hurry. He didn't try to fill the silence. When she reached for more bread, he pushed the plate closer without comment. "What happened to your jaw?" she said. He looked up, touched the scar reflexively, the way people do when reminded of something that's become wallpaper to them. "Cougar," he said. "4 winters back. Came down off the ridgeline hungry." "That must have been bad." "It was an experience," he said. He went back to eating. "Do you have a doctor up here?" "No." "A neighbor? Anyone within a few hours?" "No." She absorbed this. "When this baby comes, it'll just be us." "Yes," he said. He looked at her. "I've delivered foals, calves. A litter of pups once. I know that's not the same thing, but I'm not going to tell you it'll be easy and have you rely on that." "I'm not asking for easy," she said. "I'm asking if you know what you're doing well enough to keep us both alive." He considered that with what she was already reading as his characteristic deliberateness, the way he thought before speaking, not from slowness, but from a preference for saying the right thing over saying the comfortable thing. "Probably," he said. "That's honest," she said. "I respect that." "I could say certainly," he said. "But I'd be lying, and I don't think you want that." "No," she said. "I've had enough of that." She finished her breakfast and looked out the south-facing window at the trees and the slice of gray winter sky above them, and thought, probably is better than nothing. Probably is, in fact, more than I had yesterday. She started working the second day. Not because he asked her to. She had woken to find him already outside splitting wood, and she had simply decided that if she was going to be in this place and taking its hospitality, she would carry her own weight, and if her weight had temporary limitations, she would work around them rather than use them as reasons to be useless. She could not chop wood. She could wash the dishes and scrub the table and sweep and take inventory of the shelves and organize them more efficiently than they currently were, which apparently had not been something Garrick Voss thought about, given the arrangement of dry goods that she rearranged into something logical within an hour of paying attention to it. She found at the back of a lower shelf a small box she almost moved without opening and then did open, and found inside a collection of baby things. A small wool blanket, hand-sewn, thick and warm. 2 pairs of tiny knit socks, clearly made by someone who had done it before. A wooden rattle, smooth and simple, that rattled with dried beans inside. She stood holding the box for a long moment. When Garrick came back inside, she was still standing there. He saw the box and said nothing, just went to the stove to warm his hands. "These were already here," she said. It wasn't a question. "I made a trip down to the valley before winter," he said. "Traded for what I could, made what I couldn't trade for." "You made these." She held up one of the knit socks. "My wife taught me to knit," he said. "Long time ago." She looked at him. He was looking at the stove. "What happened to her?" Maris said quietly. The question sat in the air between them. She thought for a moment he wasn't going to answer, and she would not have pressed him if he hadn't. "They died," he said. "Her and the boy both, 7 years ago. Fever, then complications. The boy first, then her, 4 days apart." He said it like he'd said it before, to himself, in the dark, enough times to be able to say it in daylight without completely falling apart. "I came up here after." She looked at the sock in her hand, small enough to fit in her palm, knit by a man who had learned to knit from a woman he'd watched die, for a child that was not his. She did not say "I'm sorry," because she had learned that I'm sorry was often just a way of closing a door that someone had opened, and she didn't want to close this one. She said, "Thank you for making them." He nodded once and went back outside, and she stood in the cabin with the box in her hands and understood that this was not a story she had been dropped into. It was a story she was now part of, and so was he. And neither of them had gotten here in any way they would have chosen, and that, somehow, was the most honest foundation she could imagine for whatever came next. The days began to establish themselves into a kind of order, which was not something she'd expected. Garrick rose early, made fire, began whatever the day's labor was: wood, water, the trap lines he ran on the eastern ridge 3 times a week. She cooked when she could, though he was competent at it and did not perform incompetence to make her feel necessary. They worked in proximity and often in silence, and she discovered that silence with Garrick Voss was an entirely different thing from the silence she'd grown up with in her father's house. Her father's silence had been a climate, something she always had to read, prepare for, navigate around. Garrick's silence was just the absence of words, comfortable and unstormy, filling the spaces where words weren't needed. She talked sometimes, more than she expected. Maybe because it had been a long time since anyone in Red Ash Crossing had listened to her without waiting for the conversation to be over. "I was going to leave," she told him one evening, sitting by the stove while he repaired a piece of harness leather by firelight. "Before any of this, I had money saved, $43. I was going to go to the next territory, find work, figure something out. But then I was too far along to travel safely, and then my father found the money and took it." She paused. "I still don't know if he took it because he needed it or because he knew what it meant." Garrick worked the leather needle through without looking up. "Did you ask him?" "He would have lied." "Probably," he agreed. "I used to think," she said, "that I could understand him if I tried hard enough, that there was some version of him that made sense if I found the right angle to look at it from. And I stopped looking," she said. "Some things don't have an angle that makes them make sense. They're just bad." He looked up from the leather at that, just for a moment, then back down. "That's a hard thing to figure out," he said. "How old were you when you figured it out? About whatever it was for you?" "About 35, he said. "Some people are slower than others." She almost smiled. It surprised her, the almost smile, appearing without warning. "I like that you say true things," she said. "Lying takes more energy," he said. "Up here, I need all of it." But the first time she felt real fear was 2 weeks in, when the sound of horses reached them from somewhere below the tree line. It was late afternoon. Garrick was outside and she was inside, and she heard him stop moving, the particular quality of outdoor silence that happens when the person making all the noise suddenly stops. And she went to the window and looked and saw nothing but trees. But she felt it before she saw anything, the way you feel a change in weather before the sky tells you about it. She came outside. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, looking south and down. "How many?" she said. "2 horses, he said. "Maybe 3. Still a good distance." "Could be hunters." "Could be," he said. He looked at her. "Go inside. Stay by the back wall, away from the door." "I can help." "You can also fall if someone makes it past me, and then there's a problem I can't fix," he said. Not unkindly, just clearly. She went inside. She stayed near the back wall with the wood axe because she was not going to stand there with nothing, and she waited. The horses didn't come all the way up. After a while she heard voices, too distant to make out words, and Garrick's voice answering, and then silence again, and then after 20 minutes he came back inside alone. "Your father sent them," he said. "2 men. They said he wants you back and will pay $50 over what I paid." She felt the cold close around the base of her spine. "What did you say?" "I said she's not mine to sell, and she's not yours to buy," he said. "I said if they came back, I'd take it personally." "Did they believe you?" He looked at her with the even gray-green eyes that she had been reading for 2 weeks and still could not fully parse. "They believed it enough," he said. She leaned the axe back against the wall and pressed her hands flat against the rough-hewn wood and breathed. "He won't stop," she said. "You should know that. He doesn't stop. He's never stopped once he decided on something." "I know," Garrick said. "I've dealt with men like that." "Not like my father." Maybe not exactly like, he said. He picked up his coat from the peg and started checking the pockets, inventory style, the way he did when he was thinking. I'll set trip lines at the south approach. Not to hurt anyone, just to give us notice. And if they come with more men, he looked at her. Then we deal with more men, he said. One problem at a time, Maris. It was the first time he had used her name. She noticed it. She didn't say anything about it, but she noticed it, and when he went back outside to start setting the trip lines, she stood alone in the cabin and turned the sound of it over in the quiet. Maris. The way you turn a stone over to see what's underneath, and found that coming from him, it sounded like something that still belonged to her. That was the moment she decided she was going to stay. Not forever. Not from obligation. Not because she didn't have choices or because she was afraid to make them. But because up here, in this hard place, in this rough cabin that smelled of pine pitch and wood smoke, with this quiet and damaged man who knit baby socks and said true things and didn't ask her for anything, up here was the first place in 22 years where she had woken in the morning and not needed to brace herself for what the day was going to try to take from her. That was not nothing. In fact, she was beginning to think it might be everything. Outside, the wind came down off the high ridgeline, cold and purposeful, moving through the trees with the sound of something that did not negotiate. Maris laid her hand against her belly and felt the baby push back, steady and alive, and she thought, hold on, we're not done yet, not even close. She did not know yet what was coming. But she was still standing, and for now, that had to count. The trip lines held for 11 days before someone tripped one. Garrick had strung them low across the two most likely approaches from the south. A length of thin rope tied between trees at ankle height, attached to a cluster of tin cans he'd emptied and filled with pebbles. Not a weapon, just a sound. Just enough warning to be the difference between sleeping and being ready. He had explained this to Maris the same evening he set them, walking her through both approaches so she knew where they were and wouldn't trip them herself in the dark. She had asked him to show her how to reset them when they got disturbed. He'd shown her without comment. She had practiced twice until she could do it in low light. On the 11th night, just past 2 in the morning, the cans rattled on the eastern approach. Maris was already awake. The baby had been restless, pressing against her ribs in a way that made comfortable sleep a theory rather than a fact. And she heard Garrick come alert below her, the soft sound of a man going from horizontal to standing in one practiced motion. She heard the rifle come off the wall. She came down the ladder. Stay up, he said quietly. I'm not going to be useful cowering in a loft. He looked at her for a moment in the darkness. Then he handed her the revolver from the shelf by the door, the one she'd asked about 3 days ago, and he'd started teaching her to load and handle on the second day of asking. They stood on either side of the door and waited. Whatever had triggered the line did not come up to the cabin. After 20 minutes of silence, Garrick eased the door open and went out, and came back 10 minutes later. Dear, he said. She let out a breath that had been sitting in her chest for most of those 20 minutes. I nearly scared myself to death over a deer, she said. No, he said, taking the revolver back from her with careful hands. You positioned yourself by the door with a weapon and waited. That's not scared. That's ready. Scared would have been up in the loft with the blanket over your head. She considered this. Is that your way of saying something complimentary? It's my way of saying you've got reasonable instincts, he said, which is useful. Go back up and sleep. I can't sleep. He paused, looked at her. Ribs or back? Both. He pulled the second chair away from the table and said, Sit. I'll make tea. It's not much, but it's hot. They sat at the table in the dark with the fire banked low and drank something he called tea that was mostly dried bark and a few herbs he'd gathered the previous fall, and it tasted like the floor of a forest, and she drank it anyway because it was warm and because she was awake and because the alternative was lying in the loft listening to the wind and her own thoughts. Tell me about her, Maris said. She didn't explain who she meant. She thought she probably didn't need to. Garrick turned his cup in both hands. The firelight was low and orange, and in it he looked older, or maybe just more tired than he usually let show. Her name was Clara, he said. She was stubborn. Funnier than she looked, which wasn't hard because she had a face that didn't give much away until she wanted it to. He paused. She could make me feel like a fool and laugh about it in a way that made me glad she'd done it. How long were you together? 8 years before we lost the boy. 9 years total before I lost her. Maris wrapped both hands around her cup. What was the boy's name? Eli, he said. It was a short sound, just 2 letters, but she could hear how much weight it still carried for him. He was 4. She didn't say she was sorry. She had meant what she thought that night about closing doors. She just sat with it, the weight of it, in the way that 2 people can sometimes sit with grief without trying to make it smaller or move it somewhere more manageable. You built this cabin because of them, she said. I built it because I had nowhere else to go and I needed something to do with my hands, he said. But yes, because of them. She nodded. That made sense to her in a way that a more polished explanation might not have. I had a friend once, she said. Not here, before. In the town we lived in when I was 15, before my father moved us to Red Ash. Her name was Dora. She was the first person who ever told me straight that my father was wrong to treat me the way he did. Not in a delicate way, not as an observation. She just said it out loud one day like it was obvious, and she was surprised nobody else had said it to my face. Maris stopped. We moved 6 months later. I never heard from her again. You think about her? Sometimes. I think about what it meant that she said it. She looked at the cup in her hands. I'd been telling myself for years that if I was just better, just quieter, just more of what he needed, it would stop. And she looked at me and said, "It's not you, it's him." Like it was the simplest thing. She shook her head. It took me years more to actually believe it. That kind of believing takes longer than hearing, Garrick said. Yes, she said. It does. They sat in silence after that, the good kind, and eventually the tea was gone, and the fire had burned to coals, and Maris went back up to the loft and lay down, and this time she slept. The weeks settled into a rhythm that was hard in all the ways you'd expect, and strange in a few ways she hadn't. The cold deepened. The wind off the high ridges developed a personality. Not dramatic, just relentless, coming at the same angle every morning and stripping heat from anything exposed. Water froze in the bucket overnight. She learned to bring it in before dark. She learned the particular way the cabin lost heat through the north wall and started packing extra insulation there with moss and rags. She learned where the ice formed on the path to the outhouse and where you could trust your footing and where you absolutely could not. Her body made the work harder every week. Her back ached with an insistence that ranged from manageable to breathtaking. She moved more slowly. There were things she simply could no longer do. She couldn't get down on her knees to check the fire grate without a specific difficulty getting back up that she found deeply undignified, though she kept trying until Garrick, without commentary, started doing the grate himself. She didn't thank him for small things. She tried to. It came out strange. One afternoon, 3 weeks in, he had carried in extra water without being asked because the bucket she'd lugged up from the stream had been heavy, and he'd seen her face on the way back and didn't say anything about it. She'd tried to say thank you, and it came out flat, and he'd heard the flatness. You don't have to do that, he said. I know. I mean, you don't have to say it if it's uncomfortable. I'm not keeping a ledger. She looked at him. It's not uncomfortable exactly, she said. It's just, I've said thank you most of my life to people who were using it against me, counting up what I owed. It makes the words feel strange in my mouth. He considered this. Then don't say it, he said. I'll know. She almost said thank you again, caught herself, smiled instead. He turned back to the woodpile. He began teaching her more deliberately as her due date approached, and she recognized this for what it was, a man preparing against his own possible failure. He taught her how to bank the fire to last the night and restart it from coals in the morning. He taught her the snare system he used on the ridge and where the closest water source was that stayed unfrozen even in the worst cold. He showed her where he kept the provisions, the layout of what was there, how long it would last for one person if she was careful. He showed her how to reload the revolver one-handed. Why one-handed? She asked. Because you might need the other hand for the baby, he said. She didn't argue with the logic. He showed her where he'd cached an emergency pack, food, flint, a heavy blanket, a knife, in the storage space under the south wall. He'd expanded it recently, she could tell from the newer additions. A smaller blanket, softer, the kind for an infant. You've been adding to this, she said. Few weeks back, he said. You didn't tell me. You didn't need to know before now, he said. Now you do. She pressed her hand to the wall and thought about what it meant that this man, this stranger who owed her nothing, who had rebuilt his entire life around solitude and loss and the hard mathematics of surviving alone, had spent time she didn't know about preparing for the possibility that she might be alone with a newborn on a mountain, not hoping for it, just making sure that if it happened, she had a chance. Garrick, she said. He waited. If something happens to you, say, not just in the birth, any time, I want to know the trail down. I've been going by what I remember from the day we came up, but I need to know it properly. I'll take you through it tomorrow, he said. Daylight. Thank you, she said. And this time it came out clear. He nodded once. They moved on to the next thing. The men came back 4 weeks after the first two, and this time there were 4 of them. She heard the horses before the cans rattled. She'd been getting better at that, tuning herself to the sounds of the mountain the way you tune to any place you live in long enough. And she was already at the window when Garrick came from the shed where he'd been working on a broken axle. He looked at her through the glass. She held up 4 fingers. He nodded. She loaded the revolver. They came out of the trees into the lower edge of the clearing, 4 men on horseback, one of whom she recognized from Red Ash. A man named Pierce, who did occasional work for her father and who had always looked at her with the dull patience of someone waiting for something unpleasant to be finished. The other 3 were hired, she could tell by the way they moved, careful and professional and unbothered. Garrick walked to the edge of the clearing and stopped. Pierce spoke first. Voss, Mr. Holloway has authorized us to offer you $200 to release the girl. That's more than double what you paid. By any reasonable measure, that's a profit. She's not property, Garrick said. You can't release someone who isn't held. She's his daughter. He has legal standing. She's 22 years old, Garrick said. She has more legal standing than he does over her own person. You want to argue that in front of a judge, I'm happy to make the trip down the mountain. Pierce's jaw tightened. Mr. Holloway doesn't want a legal argument. He wants his daughter. What he wants and what he's going to get are 2 different conversations, Garrick said. You should head back and tell him that. There was a pause. One of the hired men glanced at Pierce, waiting for instruction. Pierce looked past Garrick toward the cabin, where Maris was standing in the doorway. Not hidden, not behind a door, but standing in it, visible and armed, with the particular quality of presence that comes from a woman who has made a decision and is at peace with it. Pierce looked at her for a long moment, then back at Garrick. This isn't finished, Pierce said. I know, Garrick said. Head back anyway. They turned their horses south and rode back into the trees, and the sound of them diminished, and Maris stood in the doorway until she could no longer hear anything but wind. Garrick walked back to the cabin. She stepped aside to let him in. He closed the door and stood with his hands at his sides, and she could see him running through the same arithmetic she was. 4 men this time, and the ones hired for their demeanor rather than their size meant her father was escalating in a particular direction. He's going to come himself, she said. Not yet, but he will. Yes, Garrick said. When he does, he won't be offering money. No, Garrick said. She sat down at the table because her feet ached, and she was 7 months into a pregnancy, and she had been standing in a doorway with a revolver for 20 minutes. She put the gun on the table and looked at it. I need you to understand something, she said. About him. Garrick sat down across from her. He is not a reasonable man when his authority is challenged. I don't mean difficult. I mean that when he decides he has been defied, something in him goes somewhere that regular things don't reach. I watched him break a neighbor's fence over a $3 debt. I watched him keep a grudge for 11 years and act on it when the opportunity came. She stopped. He sold me. In front of everyone. His own pregnant daughter. And he made himself breakfast first. Garrick was quiet. I want you to plan for the version of him that comes here with the intention of not leaving without a result, she said. Not the version that sends men and offers money. The other version. I'm already planning for that version, he said. I know, she said. I just needed to say it to you, so it was said. He nodded. She picked up the revolver and started unloading it with the methodical care he'd taught her, because she always unloaded it when she was done. Because a loaded gun sitting on a table was a different kind of problem than a loaded situation. Tell me one more thing about Clara, she said, when the gun was empty and the bullets were in her palm. Garrick blinked at the shift in subject. Then something in his face eased, very slightly, from the position it had been holding. She hated mornings, he said. She was terrible at them, couldn't form a useful sentence before her second cup of coffee, and would argue about it before the first. A pause. I used to make both cups ready before I woke her so she'd have something in her hands before she had to deal with being awake. Maurice looked at the bullets in her hand and thought about a man preparing 2 cups of coffee in the dark for someone who couldn't face the morning without them. Thought about the same man, 7 years later, alone on a mountain, learning to knit, adding infant blankets to an emergency cache for a stranger's child. She was lucky, Maurice said quietly. So was I, he said, for the time I had. She closed her hand around the bullets and held that for a moment. Not the grief of it, not the weight of it, but the other thing underneath it, the thing that said, this is what it looks like when someone lets another person matter to them fully. This is what that costs and what it's worth. She wasn't ready to say anything about what that meant for the way she was beginning to feel about the man sitting across from her. Some things need to accumulate in the dark before they can be brought into the light without falling apart. But she felt it sitting there, patient and complicated and not going away, and she let it be what it was. Outside, the mountain did what mountains do. It gave nothing. It asked everything. It offered no comfort except the brutal honesty of ground that would hold you or wouldn't, weather that would pass or wouldn't, and the company of whoever you'd managed to bring with you to the height of it. She had brought herself this far. Somehow, unexpectedly, that was turning out to be enough. The storm came down from the high peaks on a Thursday, though Maurice had stopped keeping strict track of days somewhere in her 6th week on the mountain. She knew it was Thursday because Garrick had made a mark on the cabin wall that morning. He kept a rough calendar scratched into the wood beside the door, a habit she'd noticed early and understood as the kind of thing a man does when solitude starts to blur his grip on time. She knew the storm was serious before it arrived because Garrick stopped what he was doing. That was always the signal. He was not a man who stopped moving for small things. He could work through cold and wind and fatigue and the particular low misery of a day that gave nothing back, and he did so without complaint and without drama. But that afternoon he came inside from the woodpile, set down the axe, and stood at the south window for a long moment looking at the sky. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad enough," he said. He turned from the window. "I need to bring everything in that can't get buried. How are you feeling?" "Same as this morning," she said, which was heavy, slow, with a low pressure across her back that had been building for 2 days in a way that she'd been trying not to assign meaning to. He looked at her with the particular attention he used when he was deciding whether she was telling him the truth or the version she thought he needed to hear. She looked back steadily. He nodded and went back outside. She was not telling him the full truth. The pressure in her back had shifted some time in the last hour from a general ache into something with more intention behind it. Not yet the specific rhythmic pain she'd been warned about by the older women in Red Ash, who had taken it upon themselves, in the months before her father's decision, to tell her what labor would feel like, whether she wanted to hear it or not. But something was changing, and she knew it, and the storm was coming, and she stood in the middle of the cabin and took a slow breath and said very quietly to herself and to the child, "Not yet. Give us a little more time." The child, as children do, ignored the request. Garrick worked for 2 hours straight before the first snow came down. He brought the tools in from the shed, covered the woodpile with oilcloth, secured the shutters on the outside, and checked every one of them, brought in water, more than usual, stacking full buckets against the interior wall. He moved with the focused economy of someone who had weathered serious mountain storms before and knew the difference between what you wished you'd done and what you'd actually done. Maris moved the furniture. She pushed the table toward the east wall to create clear space near the fireplace, brought the extra blankets down from the loft, organized the provisions on the shelf in the order of what they might need access to in the dark. Her back screamed at her for the pushing, and she did it anyway and then stood straight and breathed through it. By the time Garrick came back inside for good, the snow was falling in the way that means it has decided to continue. Not the pretty kind, the tentative early winter kind that dusts the pine branches and looks like something in a painting. The serious kind, coming sideways, driven by a wind that had opinions. He barred the door, turned and looked at her. She was standing with one hand on the edge of the table and the other pressed into the small of her back, and she was not moving. She had stopped moving because moving had suddenly become complicated. "Maris," he said. I know, she said. He crossed the room in 4 steps. How long? The back started 2 days ago, but I didn't want to. She stopped, breathed. It changed about an hour ago. How far apart? I haven't been timing. I didn't want to start timing because timing, it makes it real. He put his hand on her back. Not tentative, just there, flat and steady. And she felt the pressure of it against the pain in a way that helped, marginally, which surprised her. Time it now, he said. Tell me when it starts and when it eases. She nodded. They stood there together, her hand on the table and his hand on her back, and the storm pressed against the cabin walls, and Maris began to understand that the baby was not going to wait for better circumstances. The baby was not consulting the weather or the calendar or the considerable logistical problems of its own timing. The baby was arriving, and it was arriving tonight in a cabin on a mountain in the middle of a storm, with no doctor and no midwife and no neighbor within hours of help. She was afraid. She let herself be afraid, which was different from being defeated by it. Garrick, she said, when the first real contraction passed. Here, he said, tell me you've done this. Not this exactly, he said, but close enough. That's not terribly reassuring. I know, he said. I'm going to need water heating and the small blanket from the emergency cache and the knife I keep above the fireplace, and I need you to lie down. She didn't want to lie down. She told him so. I know, he said again. Do it anyway. The labor was 12 hours long, which is not long by any objective standard, but which felt, in the middle of it, like a measurement of time that had nothing to do with clocks. The storm got worse around midnight, as storms tend to, as if they have a sense of theater. Wind drove against the walls with a sound like something trying to get in. Snow came through the gap under the south shutter until Garrick wedged a rag into it without leaving her side for more than 30 seconds. The fire held. He had built it high before things got serious, and he fed it whenever it asked, and the cabin stayed warm in the specific way that places stay warm during the worst of a mountain winter. Not comfortable, not the warmth of an easy night, but the warmth of a sustained argument with the cold that you're currently winning. He did not tell her it would be all right. She was grateful for that. She had heard it'll be all right at important moments in her life, and it had almost never been followed by things being all right. And she was not interested in comfortable words that existed to manage the speaker's anxiety more than the listener's reality. What he did do, he told her what was happening in plain terms. He kept his voice even. When she gripped the edge of the sleeping pallet hard enough to make the wood creak, he put his hand where it needed to be and did not flinch from any of it. When she said, at around the 3rd hour, that she couldn't do this, he said, "You are doing it." When she said it again at the 7th hour, he said, "Still doing it." "That's not actually helpful," she said through her teeth. "What would be helpful?" "Nothing. There's nothing helpful. It's just what it is, and there's nothing to do but get through it." "Yes," he said. "That's right. I hate that you're agreeing with me. Would you like me to lie?" She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a scream, and somewhere in the middle of both, and then the next contraction came, and she stopped being interested in conversation. Around the 10th hour, she started crying, not from pain exactly, but from the specific exhaustion of a body that has been working at its absolute limit for so long that the emotion has nowhere to go except out. She cried in the ugly, graceless way of someone who has no energy to make crying look like anything other than what it is. Garrick didn't tell her to stop or try to fix it. He moved her hair off her face with a damp cloth and said, "You're doing well." "I'm a mess," she said. "You're having a baby in a snowstorm without help," he said. "If you want to cry, cry." She did. And then she gathered herself back up again because that was the only thing available to do, and she kept going. Willow arrived at 4:17 in the morning, which Maris knew because Garrick looked at the pocket watch he kept on the shelf and said the time out loud in a quiet voice, like he was noting something important in a record that needed to be accurate. She cried. The baby cried. The storm had quieted by then to a low, constant sound rather than the violent percussion of midnight, and in the relative quiet, the baby's voice was the loudest thing in the room. Garrick cleaned her and wrapped her in the small wool blanket that had been waiting in the emergency cache since before Maris had even arrived on this mountain. The one she'd found in the box weeks ago and held in her hands while she understood what kind of man she was sharing a roof with. He was efficient about it, careful, wiping the small face clean and checking fingers and toes with the same focused attention he gave everything that mattered. Then he put the baby against Maris's chest. Maris had not allowed herself to think too specifically about this moment. It had seemed dangerous to anticipate it in detail, to build a picture of it and then have something go wrong. She had kept herself at a practical distance from the imagining of it for months, all through the hardest of the pregnancy and the humiliation of the auction and the long climb up to this mountain, and now the baby was here, actual and warm and making sounds of protest against the sudden reality of being outside. And Maris looked at her face and felt something come apart inside her chest in a way that had nothing to do with pain. "Hello," she said. Her voice came out almost nothing. The baby's eyes were squeezed shut. Her fists were clenched. She was deeply unimpressed by everything so far. Garrick sat back against the wall and watched them from the other side of the room, giving them space, and Maris looked up at him across the dim light of the cabin and could not think of a single word that was adequate for what needed to be said. She thought about the emergency cash, the little socks, 2 cups of coffee in the dark, the way he had put his hand on her back without being asked and left it there for the 12 longest hours of her life. "She needs a name," he said. Maris looked down at the baby. The storm moved against the walls, quieter now, almost gentle. The fire popped once. "Willow," Maris said. "I've been carrying that name around for months." She looked up. "Is that too soft?" "No," he said. "Willow's bend in weather that breaks everything else." She held Willow, and he cleaned up in the methodical way of a man who needs to do something with his hands, while he processes something he doesn't have immediate language for, and Maris watched him move around the cabin and thought, this man has already lost a child. He built a life around that loss. And tonight, he spent 12 hours helping another one arrive safely. She didn't say any of that. Some things don't need saying. Some things just need witnessing, and she was witnessing it. They had 4 days. 4 days of the strange, exhausted peace of aftermath. Maris sleeping in the loft with Willow in the curve of her arm. Garrick running the cabin and the firewood and the water and everything else with a quiet efficiency that she could hear from above and that kept pulling her back from the edge of sleep in a way that was not unpleasant. 4 days of learning the particular schedule of a newborn, which has no schedule, which is simply a continuous series of needs arriving without advance notice. 4 days of being warm and tired and entirely consumed by the small, urgent reality of a person who had not existed 5 days ago. Garrick brought her meals up to the loft. She told him that was not necessary. He said she needed to eat, and this was how food was getting to her, and that was the end of the discussion. On the 4th morning, he came up the ladder instead of just setting food on the top rung, which was unusual, and she looked at his face and knew before he said anything that something had changed. "Horses," he said. 6 of them. Coming up the south trail. She sat up. Willow shifted against her and made a small, dissatisfied sound, and Maris held her closer automatically. "How long?" she said. "Hour? Maybe less?" She looked at him. He looked at her. They had talked about this, not this specific morning, not this specific number, but the fact of it, the inevitability of it, the version of her father who would not send more money or more hired men, but would come himself because the other 2 approaches had failed, and his authority had not been restored. "I need to get up," she said. "Maris, I need to get up," she said again, the same words but different weight behind them, and he heard the difference and stepped back to give her room to move. She came down the ladder carefully, Willow tucked against her with one arm and the other hand on the rung, and she stood in the cabin floor and looked around at what it had become. This single rough room that smelled of wood smoke and pine and something that was beginning, without her entirely noticing, to smell like home. And she took a breath. "Tell me what you have," she said. He did. The rifle, 2 revolvers now. He'd retrieved a second one from the storage space after the 4 men had come, 3 weeks ago. Ammunition. The fortifications he'd added to the south-facing wall since then, extra logs fitted against the exterior in a way that would stop or slow a rifle round. The shed positioned at an angle that provided cover for anyone moving from cabin to tree line. He had been planning for this since she'd told him her father didn't stop. He had been building for it with the same patient thoroughness he applied to everything. She looked at the reinforced wall and felt something that she immediately recognized as complicated, because she did not want this man putting himself between her and bullets on her behalf, and she also knew with the complete certainty of someone who had run out of other options that there was no version of this morning that did not require someone standing in the way. "I want to be outside," she said. "No," he said immediately. "Garrick, you had a baby 4 days ago. You're not standing in a yard with a rifle." "I can stand in a doorway." "With Willow?" She stopped. He looked at her. "I need to know she's in here and you're in here," he said. "I can manage 6 men if I'm not managing 6 men and wondering where the 2 of you are." She wanted to argue with the logic. She couldn't. She had learned over these weeks that his logic was rarely wrong, and that arguing with it out of pride was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. "Then come back," she said. "That's the plan," he said. "I'm not asking about a plan," she said. "I'm telling you to come back." He looked at her for a long moment, and she held his gaze, and she knew he understood what she was not saying in those words. And he understood it the way 2 people understand things that haven't been formally put into language yet, but are nonetheless completely clear. "Yes," he said. "I'll come back." He checked both revolvers and the rifle and went out. The men arrived in the late morning, and Elias Holloway was among them. She heard the horses from inside the cabin. She was near the south window where she could see the edge of the clearing without being visible from outside. And she saw her father's horse come out of the tree line first, a big gray she recognized from home, and something moved through her chest when she saw him. That was not love and was not entirely fear, and was the specific feeling of a person looking at the source of damage that defined most of their life up to this point. He looked older. She noticed that first. Older and angry in the particular way of a man whose anger has been sharpening on a stone for months, and has reached a point that could cut without him even trying. There were 5 men behind him, not the hired professional kind from before. These were local men from Red Ash. She could see it in their horses and their clothes, which meant her father had convinced or pressured people who knew her name to come up a mountain and take her back. That told her something about what the last 2 months had cost him in terms of standing, that he'd had to drag in neighbors instead of professionals. Garrick was in the clearing. She could see his back. "Holloway," he said. No volume to it, just the word, establishing something. Her father pulled his horse up at the edge of the clearing and looked at Garrick the way he looked at anything he'd decided was an obstacle. "You've had your time with her," he said. "I'm taking her home." "She is home," Garrick said. "She's my daughter." "She's her own person. She's been her own person. You just didn't want to acknowledge it because it was inconvenient." Her father's jaw moved. Behind him, the 5 men sat their horses with the shifty discomfort of people who've been told a thing is straightforward and are beginning to suspect it isn't. "I'll have you charged," her father said. "Theft, kidnapping. Whatever a judge will hear." "You sold her," Garrick said. "I've got 30 witnesses from your own town who watched you do it. You want to stand in front of a judge and explain why you sold your adult daughter on a platform like she was livestock? I'll make that trip to the county seat myself, and I'll enjoy every minute of it." Silence. The horses moved their feet. One of the men in the back, she recognized him now, Avery Crane, who ran the feed store in Red Ash and had 3 daughters of his own, looked at the back of her father's head with the expression of someone recalculating something. Her father reached for the rifle across his saddle. Garrick had the revolver up before the motion was finished, not pointing at her father, at the ground between them, but up and visible and absolutely steady. "Don't," he said. "I'm asking you not to." "You don't have standing..." "I'm not talking about standing," Garrick said. "I'm talking about what happens in the next 30 seconds if you pull that rifle. I'm asking you not to because once something starts, it doesn't always stop where you intend it to." Her father's hand stayed on the rifle stock. The clearing was perfectly still, and then Avery Crane said from the back of the group, "Elias, this ain't right." Her father turned in the saddle. "Stay out of this." "I got 3 girls," Avery said. "I watched you walk Maris out on that platform, and I didn't say a word, and I've thought about that every day since. I'm not riding any further up this mountain to drag her back." One of the other men, she didn't know him, turned his horse around without speaking and started back down the trail. Then another. Her father was left with 2 men who had the uncomfortable posture of people who would prefer to be somewhere else and were waiting for permission to become somewhere else. The rifle stayed where it was. Garrick's revolver stayed where it was. And the clearing held that quality of a moment right before something breaks one way or the other. It was her father who finally moved his hand away from the rifle. Not from generosity, not from having a change of heart. She knew him well enough from the shape of his shoulders to read the specific quality of his retreat. A man who is declining a fight not because the fight is wrong, but because the arithmetic has stopped working in his favor. He was still certain he was right. He would die certain he was right. He was simply out of leverage. "This will have consequences," he said. His voice was even. That was the most frightening version of him. "Maybe," Garrick said, "but not today." Her father turned the gray horse around and rode back into the trees, and the two remaining men followed, and Avery Crane paused at the tree line and looked back at the cabin, at the window where Maris was standing, and gave a small nod. Not an apology, more like an acknowledgement, an admission of a debt that couldn't fully be paid. She didn't nod back, but she watched him go. Garrick stood in the clearing until the sound of horses was completely gone. Then he put the revolver away and turned toward the cabin. Inside, Willow had woken and was making the specific sound that meant she was done being patient about hunger. Maris went to her, picked her up, held her against her shoulder. The door opened. Garrick came in. He looked at her and at the baby and at the whole small hard-won fact of the two of them standing in this cabin that was theirs in every way that mattered, and he sat down in the chair and put his face in his hands for a moment. Just a moment, just the length of a breath that had been held too long. And then he straightened up again. "You all right?" she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. "Were you scared?" He thought about it. "Not of them," he said. "Of the other thing. Of what it would mean for you and her if it went wrong." She sat down at the table across from him, Willow against her chest, making small, impatient sounds. Garrick looked at the baby the way he sometimes looked at her, with the careful attention of someone who has learned that some things need to be seen fully to be believed. "She looks like you," he said. "She looks like a very angry small potato," Maris said. Something in his face shifted. It was the closest she'd ever seen to a full, unguarded smile. Not broad, nothing about Garrick Voss was broad, but real, coming from somewhere under the scar, and the years, and the specific weight he'd been carrying since before she arrived. "She'll grow out of it," he said. "The potato part? Or the angry part?" "Both, probably," he said. "One faster than the other." She laughed. It came out raw and slightly unhinged, which was appropriate for a woman who'd had a baby 4 days ago and had just watched 6 men ride away from a mountain clearing, and Garrick let her laugh and looked at the fire with that quiet expression of his, and Willow protested the vibration of her mother laughing by protesting louder, and the cabin was full of it, the noise, the aliveness of it, the unreasonable, unglamorous, badly timed fact of all of them being here. Outside, the storm's last remnants melted slowly off the pine branches in the strengthening morning light. The mountain gave nothing away, same as always. But in the cabin, something that had been braced against the cold for a very long time was, slowly and carefully, beginning to let go. 3 weeks after her father rode back down the mountain, Maris got a letter. She didn't know how it reached her. Someone must have told someone in Red Ash that the trapper Voss received mail at the trading post in Kellner's Ford, 12 miles south, and Garrick came back from his monthly supply run with it tucked inside his coat. He handed it to her without comment when he walked in, just looked at her face when she took it, and held it without opening it. "You don't have to read it," he said. "I know," she said. She turned it over. Her name was on the front in her father's handwriting, which she'd spent years learning to read from across a room, when it was calm and when it wasn't, which kind of evening was coming. She knew every variation of how he wrote the H in Holloway. She opened it. The letter was 2 pages, which surprised her. She'd expected one, or half of one, a demand restated, a threat dressed in formal language. What she got instead was 2 pages of the dense, careful penmanship of a man who had composed and recomposed something many times before committing it to paper, and it read less like correspondence and more like an argument he was having with himself that she'd been copied in on. He wrote that she had embarrassed him. That was the first page, mostly. The shape of the embarrassment, the particulars of it, how it had spread through Red Ash, what people were saying, how Avery Crane had told the story at the feed store, and how the telling had made Elias Holloway into something he had never intended to be. He wrote that he had only done what he had to do given her intransigence, that she had forced his hand, that the situation was of her making. He wrote these things in the tight, careful language of a man who needed them to be true so badly that he'd written them down to make them more solid. The second page was different. Halfway through the second page, the handwriting changed. Not dramatically, but she could see it. A slight loosening, like the hand had gotten tired of holding itself so correctly. And the sentences changed too. He wrote, "Your mother would not have recognized what I did." He wrote it in the middle of a sentence about something else, and then he did not follow it up, or explain it, or walk it back. He just left it there and kept going, the way a man leaves a stone turned over in a field without being able to say why he stopped to turn it. He did not apologize. That was not a thing Elias Holloway was constructed to do. But there was something in those last paragraphs that she recognized with a kind of exhausted clarity, as the closest he was capable of getting to it. He closed by saying he would not come up the mountain again. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket and stood at the window for a while. Garrick was unpacking the supplies from the saddlebags, giving her the room she needed to have whatever reaction was coming. That was something she'd learned about him over these months. He understood the difference between being present and being in the way, and he navigated that distinction better than anyone she'd ever known. "He says he won't come back," she said finally. "Do you believe him?" She thought about it. "Yes," she said. "Not because he's changed, because he's recalculated." She turned from the window. He spent all that effort and still went home alone. There's no version of this story where he wins now, and he knows it, so he's quitting the field. "That's not nothing," Garrick said. "No," she said, "it's not. But it's also not the thing I needed him to say, and he didn't say it." She pulled the letter from her pocket and looked at it again. "He wrote that my mother would not have recognized what he did." Garrick stopped unpacking. "That's the realest line in 2 pages, she said, and he buried it in the middle like he didn't mean to write it. "Maybe he didn't," Garrick said. "Some things get out before you decide to let them." She looked at him. He was looking at the letter in her hands, not at her. "Is that what happened with you?" she said. "The socks, the blankets, getting on your horse and riding into town?" He was quiet for a moment. "Some things you do before you know why," he said. "The why comes later." She folded the letter a second time and held it. Then she went to the fireplace and put it in, not from anger. She stood there and watched it catch and thought, "The ash doesn't mean I'm done with this. It means I'm done carrying it in my pocket." There was a difference, and she was only beginning to understand how important the difference was. Spring came late to the high ridges, reluctant and gradual, the way everything at altitude happens. Not the sudden green burst of the valley, but a slow conversation between the cold and the sun that went back and forth for weeks before the sun started winning consistently. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slope first, then the woodpile, then the path to the stream, revealing the ground underneath in stages, dark and wet and smelling of everything that had been waiting underneath all winter. Willow was 3 months old and had opinions about everything. She had opinions about the light through the south window, which she wanted to stare at until Maris moved her. She had opinions about being put down, which she expressed without ambiguity. She had opinions about the particular blanket that was her first choice versus any other blanket and could not be deceived about the substitution. She was small and demanding and startlingly alert, and she had already discovered that Garrick, who had the deep voice and the calm hands and the particular quality of stillness that some babies find enormously interesting, was a source of reliable entertainment. Maris had watched this develop with a private, complicated feeling she hadn't entirely catalogued. The first time she'd come down from the loft and found Willow in Garrick's arms, awake and quiet with her small fist wrapped around his finger, she'd stopped at the bottom of the ladder and just looked. He hadn't noticed her for a moment. He was looking at the baby with the careful, full attention he gave important things, not the performative softness that people sometimes put on around infants, not anything theatrical, just genuine regard. Then he'd looked up and seen Maris watching and said, without any particular inflection, "She woke up. I didn't want her to wake you." "I was already awake," Maris said. "I know," he said, "but I thought you might appreciate the choice." She had, in fact, appreciated the choice. She had also stood there for a long moment after he looked back down at Willow and thought about what it meant that she felt what she felt looking at the two of them together. And then she had made coffee, because there were things she wasn't ready to examine in daylight yet. That had been 2 months ago. Now Willow grabbed for Garrick's beard when he leaned over her and he let her, with the resigned patience of a man who has accepted this particular indignity, and Maris watched them from the table over her coffee cup and did not look away. She knew what she felt. She had known it for a while. The question had never been what. It had been when and how, and whether she was ready to take something she wanted when wanting things had cost her so much before. He asked her to walk with him in the 3rd week of April. Not unusual. They walked the property often, checking the tree line, following the trap routes, simply moving because the winter had kept them inside so long that being outside felt like a requirement rather than a preference. But this was different in the way it was asked, a specific offer, a specific afternoon, with something in his voice that she read immediately and that she let herself read without pretending she hadn't. Willow was asleep in the cabin, which she would not be for long, but which gave them the particular suspended peace of parents learning to move quickly when windows like this appeared. They walked the south meadow, where the snow was fully gone and the first thin grass had come up. The mountains above them still had their white caps, and probably would for another month. But down at this elevation, the air had changed, lighter and less insistent than winter air. They walked for a while without talking, which was fine. Comfortable silence had been one of the first real gifts she'd found in this place, and she'd stopped taking it for granted. He stopped at the flat rock above the stream where she sometimes sat in the mornings when Garrick had Willow, and she needed 20 minutes to exist as something other than someone's mother or someone's problem. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it plainly." "All right," she said. He looked at the stream below, then at her. "I know how you came here," he said. "I know you didn't come here by choice, and I know that every good thing you've built since then you built yourself, out of nothing, on a mountain, that's not a small thing, Maris. That's most people's entire life compressed into 6 months." He stopped, started again. "I'm not good at this." "You're doing fine," she said. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to know that whatever you answer, nothing changes. The cabin is yours as long as you want it. Willow has a home here. You're not—" He stopped again, pressed his hands flat against the sides of his legs. "You're not obligated to me in any direction." "I know that," she said quietly. "I know you know it," he said. "I'm saying it out loud because I need it to be clear before I say the rest." She waited. "I would like to marry you," he said. "Not because of Willow and not because of practicalities. Because of you. Because you are someone I want to be near. I want to be near you for a long time." He looked at her with the even gray-green eyes that she had been reading for 6 months and understood now in most of the ways a person can be understood. "I'm not asking you to want that back. I'm asking if you do." The stream ran below them, catching the afternoon light. She had thought about this. Not in a planning way, not in the way she'd thought about practical things, the supplies, the trail, the trip lines. In the way that you think about something when you're not trying to, when you're feeding a baby at 3 a.m, or watching a man bank a fire, or lying awake listening to the mountains settle in the cold, and the thought arrives fully formed and stays. "I want to tell you something first," she said. "All right. I spent most of my life having things decided for me," she said. "My circumstances, my options, what I was allowed to want. And I was so angry about that for so long that when I got up here and found something that felt like it could be mine, I was afraid of it. Because wanting things had always come with a cost I hadn't been warned about." She looked at him. "That's not the same as not wanting them." He was very still. "I want that," she said. "I want you, not because I owe you and not because you're what's available. Because you're honest and you're careful with things that matter, and you can sit in a silence that isn't a threat, and you knit terrible socks for babies you've never met." Her voice caught slightly on that last part, which she hadn't anticipated. "Because you said probably, when probably was the true answer, and you said it like you weren't ashamed of it." Something moved across his face, not the half-smile she'd seen occasionally, something older and more open than that. The expression of a man who has been careful with his own, hoping for so long that having a hope actually answered is almost too large to hold. Terrible socks, he said. The tension was inconsistent, she said. I was working from memory, he said. It had been years. They were perfect, she said. I just needed to say something true back. He reached out and took her hand. Not a gesture, not a performance, just a hand around hers, the way he did most things, deliberate and without drama. They stood there above the stream in the first real warmth of the year and let it be what it was. The wedding was small by any standard, which was appropriate for two people who had not been looking for witnesses. Avery Crane came up the mountain. That surprised her. He arrived on a Saturday morning leading a second horse with his wife, Bertrice, who Maris had known slightly in Red Ash, and who climbed down from the horse and looked at the cabin and said, "Well, you've made it livable," which was the most Bertrice Crane had ever said to her in one breath, and which Maris took as the compliment it was intended to be. They had written to the circuit judge in Kellner's Ford, who sent back a form and instructions that Avery witnessed and signed. It was not romantic in the conventional sense. It was a legal document and two witnesses in a morning that felt like an ordinary morning in most of its outward respects, except that by the end of it she had a different name if she wanted it. She kept Maris Holloway. She had thought about this and decided that she was not going to let her father's name become a reason to erase herself. Holloway was her mother's name too. It was her own name, grown in hard ground, and she was keeping it. But she added Voss alongside it, not instead, and the judge's form had room for both. Garrick did not argue with this. She had expected him to have an opinion about it, and he'd said, "It's your name. You carry it." That was all. Avery Crane shook Garrick's hand at the end of it and said, "You're a hard man to read, Voss." He said it like it was a compliment. "I've been told," Garrick said. Bertrice held Willow for approximately 3 minutes, and then declared her to be the most alert baby she had personally encountered, which was saying something as she had 5 grandchildren of reference. Willow grabbed for Bertrice's hairpin and was gently redirected and expressed her displeasure about this, and Bertrice said, "Yes, well, life is full of hairpins you can't have," which Maris thought was one of the wiser things she'd heard recently. They stayed for the afternoon and rode down before dark, and then it was just the 3 of them again, which was what they were. That evening, after Willow was asleep, they sat by the fire the way they always had, his chair and her chair, the table between them. And it was both entirely ordinary and completely different, and Maris held that strangeness and found it did not resolve into one thing or the other. It was simply both. That seemed right. "What happens now?" she said. "Same things," he said. Work, winter, spring again." "Is that enough for you?" He looked at the fire. "It got enough a long time ago," he said. "Before you came." He looked at her. "It's more than enough now." She turned her cup in her hands. "I want to do something," she said. "Not just survive up here. I want... when Willow is older. When we have more time." She paused. "I keep thinking about the other women in Red Ash. The ones who watched and said nothing. Not because they didn't care, but because they had nowhere to go. Because there was nothing." "What are you thinking?" "I don't know yet," she said. "Something. A place. Somewhere that would have been somewhere I could have gone, if it had existed." She stopped. "Does that sound—" "No," he said. "It doesn't sound anything except like you." She looked at him. "You'd help with that." "I would," he said. "Yes." She nodded. Filed it away in the part of herself where plans lived before they were ready to be plans. Warm and unfinished, needing time to set. Outside, the spring night was cold and clear, and the stars above the ridgeline were the specific stars of high altitude, brighter and more numerous than they ever were down in the valley, like the mountain kept its own sky. Willow slept. The fire held. Garrick reached across the table and turned his hand palm up without looking away from the fire, and Maris put her hand in his. It was not the life she had been moving toward when this all began. It was not anything she could have predicted from the platform in Red Ash Crossing with her wrists tied, and the crowd watching and the weather vane on the general store turning in the cold wind. It was the life that had been waiting on the other side of every hard thing she'd survived to get here. And it was hers. Not given to her, not assigned, not purchased. Chosen. By her, for herself, in full knowledge of what she was choosing. That was the thing her father had never understood. That was the thing he'd tried to take from her and hadn't quite managed to reach. You could take a person's options. You could take their money and their plans and their dignity on a public platform in front of everyone who knew their name. You could make every exit look like a wall, but you could not take the choosing once it arrived. You could not get to it in time. She had chosen, and she was still here. And in the other room, her daughter slept with the easy certainty of someone who had never yet been given reason to doubt that the world she woke into would hold her. Maris intended to keep it that way for as long as she had breath to do so. The idea that had lived in Maris like an unfinished sentence through that first spring slowly took shape the way most real things do. Not all at once, not from a single moment of inspiration, but from accumulation. From one thing, and then another thing, and then a third thing that connected the first two in a way that made the whole structure visible. The first thing was a woman named Sarah. She arrived on the mountain in June of the second year, on foot, with a child on her hip and nothing else. She had walked 3 days from a settlement east of Red Ash called Dalton's Creek, and she was wearing a dress with a torn sleeve and the particular expression of someone who has made a decision that terrified them and is only now discovering they do not know what comes after the decision. She had heard, from who she couldn't say, it had traveled the way stories travel in small communities through suggestion and half-sentence and the specific quality of information people share when the person who needs it most might be listening. That there was a woman on the Harrow Mountain who had gotten out. She found the cabin at midday. She stood at the edge of the clearing for a long moment, like she wasn't sure the place was real, and then Maris came out the door. She'd heard footsteps on the south path. She always heard them now. It had become reflex. And the two women looked at each other across 20 feet of yard. Sarah said, "I didn't know where else to go." Maris said, "Come inside. Are you hungry?" That was how it started. Sarah stayed a week, then 2, then a month. Her child, a boy just past 2 years old called Ned, attached himself to Garrick with the specific devotion of a very small person who has not recently had a reliable male presence and finds one and will not release it. Garrick bore this with equanimity, which meant he went about his work with a toddler following him at ankle height and adjusted his pace accordingly without complaint. When Sarah was ready to talk about what she was leaving, she talked. Maris listened the way she'd learned to listen, without filling in the parts or rushing toward the resolution, because that was not what someone needed when they were finally saying out loud the thing they'd been carrying alone. She listened, and she made coffee, and she did not once say "I understand" in the hollow way people say it when they mean, "I want you to know I'm paying attention," without actually requiring myself to feel the weight of what you're telling me. After 2 months, Sarah was different. Not fixed. There is no fixing for certain things, and pretending there is only delays the real work. But steadier. She had started helping with the cooking, then with the garden Maris had put in along the south slope, then with teaching Ned his letters using a board and chalk Garrick had brought up from Kellner's Ford. She was capable and sharp and angry in a productive rather than a consuming way, and Maris looked at her one evening and thought, here is the second piece. "I want to write to someone," Maris told Garrick that night. "A woman in the next territory. I heard about her from Bertrice Crane. She runs a house for women who need somewhere to be while they sort out what comes next. She's been doing it for years." "What do you want to write to her for?" "Because she's done this longer than me, and she'll have made the mistakes I haven't made yet," Maris said. "And I'd rather know what they are before I make them." He looked at her. "You've decided, then?" "I decided a year ago," she said. "I just needed to know we had enough room." "We don't," he said. "Not yet." She looked at him. "But we can build it," he said. They built it over 3 years. Not quickly, not without setbacks. Not in the uncomplicated way of a project that goes according to plan. The second structure went up the summer after Sarah arrived. A second cabin, smaller, rougher, positioned 30 yards northeast of the first, built by Garrick, and a man named Cole Whitfield, who had come up the mountain looking for work after losing his farm and who stayed 2 years and built half of what Haven Ridge eventually became before he moved on to the valley with enough saved to start again. Maris wrote to the woman in the next territory. Her name was Hedda Marsh, and she wrote back with 3 pages of practical information and 0 sentimentality, which Maris appreciated enormously. They corresponded for years. Hedda told her what to watch for in women who arrived in crisis. The difference between someone who needed immediate help and someone who needed long-term structure. The difference between a woman who would stay and build and a woman who needed to pass through on her way somewhere else, and would be better served being helped to move than pressured to remain. She told her about the men who sometimes came looking, how to handle county officials who asked questions with the specific quality of questions that were really statements, how to keep records in a way that was useful without being the kind of records that could be used against you. Maris kept everything Hedda wrote and added her own notes alongside it, and what started as letters became a kind of working document that she revised and built on as her own experience accumulated. Willow grew. This was the fact that organized everything else, not as a distraction from the work, but as its living proof. Willow, who had been born in a storm with thunder rattling the valley, and no one in the world to help except a man who'd lost his own child, and put that grief to work instead of letting it consume him. Willow, who had grown from the demanding infant with opinions about blankets into a small girl with her mother's directness and her father's quietness, and a particular talent for appearing at exactly the moment when two adults were trying to have a conversation they hadn't decided to have yet. She was 4 when she asked Garrick, with the blunt simplicity of a child who has not yet learned to approach difficult things sideways. "Are you my papa?" They were sitting at the table. Maris had been washing dishes at the basin. She went still. Garrick looked at Willow for a moment, then he said, "Do you want me to be?" Willow considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," she said. "Then I am," he said. Willow seemed to find this a satisfactory resolution to what had apparently been an ongoing internal negotiation, and went back to the piece of wood she'd been turning into something unidentifiable with a small knife Garrick had made for her specifically, with a handle sized for small hands. Maris kept washing dishes. Her hands were shaking slightly, which she did not comment on. That night after Willow was asleep, she said to Garrick, "You know she's going to tell everyone." "I know," he said. "Including eventually the question of her actual—" "When that question comes up, we'll answer it honestly," he said. "She deserves the truth. She also deserves a father who is present and choosing to be there, and those things can both be true." Maris looked at him. "When did you get wise?" "I've always been wise," he said. "I was just quiet about it." She laughed. He allowed himself a small smile. Outside, the summer night was full of the particular sounds of a mountain that had gone from a place of exile to a place of life. The small second cabin with its light in the window where Sarah and Ned slept. The new garden along the south slope. The storage shed with its expanded provisions. Haven Ridge. It had not been named by anyone in a deliberate act of naming. It had simply become what people called it, the way places get their names. From what they do, rather than from what someone decided they should be called. The news of Elias Holloway's death came in the 8th year. A letter from Danny, her brother, who had been out east working rail all this time, and had sent money home twice a year and had not asked questions because asking questions meant having to decide what to do with the answers, and he had chosen not to know. He wrote that their father had died of a lung illness the previous winter, quietly, in the farmhouse in Red Ash. He wrote that there had been no suffering at the end, which Maris read twice and set down because she wasn't sure how she felt about that. She didn't feel what she'd expected to feel. She'd spent years imagining this news, sometimes with anger, sometimes with a complicated relief, once in a dark period of the 3rd winter with something closer to grief, which had surprised and disturbed her until she understood that you could grieve the parent a person should have been without forgiving the parent they were. Those were separate rooms. What she felt, reading Danny's letter, was mostly a kind of settling. The way a thing that has been held slightly off balance for years finally finds its level. Danny wrote also that their father had left the farm. He wrote that it was Maris's, if she wanted it, that Elias had put this in his papers, not as a statement of apology exactly, more as a correction of arithmetic, like he was balancing a ledger he hadn't been able to balance while alive. Danny wrote that he himself did not want the farm, and had no intention of returning east. He wrote, "I don't know if this means anything to you. I thought you should know." She put the letter on the table and walked outside. The morning was clear and cold, early fall, the aspen on the lower slopes already going gold. She stood in the yard of Haven Ridge, their yard now, this place that had grown from one cabin and a trip line and a woman who had nothing left into something with 4 structures and a garden and a small community of women and children who were in various stages of putting themselves back together. And she breathed the mountain air that she had been breathing for 8 years and let her father be dead. Not with bitterness, not with triumph, with the strange, flat finality of a chapter ending that had been going on too long and had not ended well, but had at least ended, and now there was only the work of what came after it. Garrick found her there. He read her face and stood beside her without speaking. "He left me the farm," she said. "What do you want to do with it?" She thought about Hedda Marsh's letters, about Sarah, who was still here, who had become as essential to the running of Haven Ridge as anyone, who handled the new arrivals with a combination of practical efficiency and remembered understanding that Maris could not have replicated. About the women who had come through over the years, a handful the first year, more as word spread, 15 in the last year alone, some staying weeks and some months, and some, like Sarah, building their lives into the place itself. "Sell it," she said. "Use the money to build the fourth structure properly. The one we've been putting off because the timber costs were too high." "Your father's farm money building a shelter for women escaping men like your father," Garrick said. Not with drama, just stating the fact of it. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what it is." He nodded once. "Good use of money," he said. She looked at him sideways. "You could say something more significant than that." "It is significant," he said. "I just said it plainly." She leaned against him. Not a collapse, not a performance of grief, just the weight of 8 years finding a place to rest for a moment. He put his arm around her and they stood in the yard of the thing they had built and looked at the mountains above them, still there, still indifferent, still beautiful in the particular way of things that do not notice whether you survive them or not. She had survived, more than survived. But she had learned over these years not to say that carelessly, not to flatten the difficulty of it into a clean narrative of triumph, because the women who came through Haven Ridge didn't need a triumph narrative. They needed someone who knew what the middle of it felt like. The long, ugly middle where there was no clear sign that it would resolve and no guarantee that surviving was the direction things were headed. She had lived in that middle. She refused to pretend it hadn't been what it was. That was the thing she brought to every woman who arrived at the edge of the clearing, not sure if the place was real, not the arrival at the good end of the story, but the knowledge of what it cost to get there and the absolute certainty that the cost did not make the getting there impossible. Willow was 12 when she started helping, not in a formal way. She was 12, she was a child, and Maris was careful about the difference between giving a child responsibility that built them and giving them weight that belonged to adults. But Willow had been raised in this place, and she had a child's instinctive understanding of what the new arrivals needed most in their first hours, which was usually not a woman with a plan and a history of her own hardship, but a girl who would sit next to them and share whatever was being cooked and talk about something ordinary. And Willow was extraordinarily good at ordinary. She was also, at 12, already asking questions that kept Maris up at night with the quality of them. "Mama," she said one evening, sitting at the table while Maris went through the correspondence. There was always correspondence now. Women writing from 3 territories asking about Haven Ridge, asking what it cost, asking what they needed to bring. "Why do they always apologize when they get here?" Maris looked up. "What do you mean?" "The new ones," Willow said. "They always say sorry. Sorry for showing up, sorry for needing things, sorry for crying. Why do they do that?" Maris set down the letter she'd been reading. "Because they've spent a long time being told that needing things was something to be ashamed of," she said. Willow thought about this. "That's backwards," she said. "Yes," Maris said. "It is. We should tell them that when they arrive, right at the start." "We do," Maris said. "It just takes a while for it to get from hearing to believing." Willow considered this with the characteristic thoroughness that Maris recognized as being entirely her father's. Then she said, "How long did it take you?" Maris looked at her daughter, this person who had arrived in a storm with thunder shaking the valley and had been opinionated about blankets before she was a day old and had grown into someone with her mother's directness and her father's patience, and something entirely her own that Maris had no language for except Willow. And she thought about the honest answer. "Years," she said, "but I had help." Willow looked over at Garrick, who was across the room working leather by firelight, in the way he'd been working leather by firelight for a decade. The same posture, the same quiet, fundamentally unchanged by the years in all the ways that mattered. "Papa," Willow said. He said. "Were you scared? When you went to the auction and bought Mama?" He didn't look up from the leather. "I wasn't buying your mama," he said. "I was buying the end of an auction." "But were you scared?" A pause. "A little," he said. "Not of the men or the situation. Scared I was doing the wrong thing, that I'd make it worse somehow." "Why did you do it then?" He set down the leather and looked at her with the full attention he gave things that deserved it. "Because not doing it was worse," he said. "Sometimes that's the whole of the decision. Not because you're certain you're right, because you're certain you can't stand there and do nothing." Willow absorbed this the way she absorbed most information, completely, filing it somewhere she would retrieve it later, probably at the exact moment it was most relevant. "Okay," she said, and went back to her own work. Maris looked at Garrick across the room, and he met her eyes, and something passed between them that did not need words and would not have been improved by them. The years were not without loss. That needs to be said because the alternative is a lie, and this story has tried hard not to lie. There was a winter in the 11th year that took two of the older women in the community, one from an illness that came on fast and did not slow, one from an injury that should not have been fatal and was. Maris sat with both of them and did what she could, and it was not enough. And she carried that with her the way you carry certain things. Not constantly in your hands, but there, in the pocket, heavy and specific. There was a year when the money ran short, and she had to make decisions about what the place could sustain and what it couldn't. And those decisions meant turning some people away or telling them the wait was long. And she hated it with a clean, directed hatred that she used as fuel to go back to Hedda Marsh's letters and her own notes and figure out what she'd missed and how to do better. There was a legal challenge in the 14th year from a county official in Kellner's Ford who had decided that Haven Ridge was operating outside the bounds of what a private citizen was permitted to do without a formal charter, and Maris rode down the mountain for the first time in years to sit across a desk from him and explain, in the even tone of someone who has been preparing for exactly this conversation for a long time, precisely what Haven Ridge was and what it wasn't and what would happen if he decided to make this difficult. She had brought documentation. She had brought the names of 12 county residents who had written letters on behalf of the community, including Avery Crane, who was 62 by then and had lost none of his willingness to say uncomfortable things out loud in rooms that didn't want to hear them. The official decided not to make it difficult. She rode back up the mountain with the paperwork that made Haven Ridge official, formally, legally, on paper. And she put it on the shelf above the fireplace next to the letter from her father that she'd taken out of the fire, which she had, in fact, retrieved from the coals before it finished burning on the day she'd put it in. She had not told Garrick this at the time. She had put it back in her pocket, and it had lived in the bottom of her coat for years, and eventually she had put it on the shelf because she'd decided it belonged there. Not as something she was holding on to, but as evidence of where she'd come from, of what the distance was between there and here. Haven Ridge, at its fullest, held 23 people in a good season. Not all at once, not permanently. It moved, it breathed, people arrived and people left, and some left and came back and some left for good, and sent word years later that they had built something of their own in some distant place, which was the best possible news because that was what Haven Ridge was for. Not to hold people, to give them somewhere to stand while they figured out where they were going. Willow left at 19 to study medicine in the East. There was a school that had started accepting women the year before she was old enough to apply, and she had written to them herself, drafted the letter herself, and told her parents after she'd sent it. Maris had held the copy of the letter and read it and said nothing for a moment, then said, "You applied before you told us." "Yes," Willow said. "Why?" "Because if you'd known I was applying and I didn't get in, I didn't want to have that conversation," Willow said. "And because I wanted to know I could do it myself first." Maris looked at her daughter and recognized, with the complicated recognition of a parent looking at a child who has become someone, the specific quality of decision-making that was entirely her own and had nothing to do with being taught and everything to do with being Willow. "You got in," Maris said. "Yes," Willow said. "Then go," Maris said. She cried after Willow's horse was out of sight, which she had not planned on doing and which happened anyway, and Garrick stood next to her and did not tell her it was fine because he knew. She knew it was fine, and the knowing didn't stop the crying, and he handed her his handkerchief, and that was enough. She was 51 years old when she finally understood what had happened to her. Not that she hadn't known the facts of it. She'd known the facts for 30 years, had told the story in one form or another to hundreds of women who needed to hear that someone else had stood on that particular ground and found a way forward from it. But understanding is a different thing from knowing, and it comes when it comes, which is rarely when you are expecting it or when it would be convenient. She was sitting on the flat rock above the stream. She still went there, still needed the 20 minutes of existing as something other than someone's mother or someone's leader, still went with her coffee in the early morning before the rest of Haven Ridge was awake. And she was watching the water, and she thought, without any particular reason to think it right then, I am not what happened to me. Simple. Not new. She had said something like it to women over the years, but she'd been saying it as a thing she knew, and this morning it arrived as a thing she felt in the bones, below the knowing, down in the place where the body keeps its own record of what it has survived. She was not the auction. She was not the tied wrists or the crowd watching or the sound of her father's voice assigning her a value in dollars. She was not the fear or the exhaustion or the long climb up a mountain to a stranger's cabin with a baby coming and no guarantees. Those things had happened to her. They had shaped her the way weather shapes stone, not by adding anything but by removing the parts that couldn't hold. What was left was this. This woman on this rock in this morning, with her coffee going cold in her hands and the water running below her and the mountain above her doing what mountains do, which is endure. She heard footsteps on the path and did not turn around because she knew them. Garrick sat down on the rock beside her, which he had been doing for 29 years, and he had his own coffee, and he looked at the stream, and he did not ask what she was thinking because he had learned long ago that she would tell him when she was ready and not before. I've been thinking about what we did here, she said. What about it? About why it works, she said. I used to think it was because I knew what these women had been through, that I could help because I'd been through something similar. She paused. But that's not it, or not all of it. What is it then? She watched the water. It works because we never told anyone what they should want, she said. We just gave them a place to figure out what that was. We never told them the right way to be after the hard thing. We just said, you're here, you're safe, what do you need today? She stopped. My father always knew what I should want. That was the whole problem. He was so certain about what I should be that there was no room for what I was. Garrick was quiet. I think that's the only thing that actually helps anyone, she said. Not telling them who to be, just making enough space that they can find out. He drank his coffee. Then he said, That's what you do. I know, she said. I'm just figuring out why it works, not whether it does. Does it matter why? She thought about it. Yes, she said. Because Willow is going to do this. Not here, somewhere else, in her own way. And I want her to know not just what to do, but why, so she can teach whoever comes after her. She looked at him, because we're not going to be here forever, and this needs to be bigger than us. He looked at her. He was older. They were both older, worn in the specific ways of people who have spent their lives working hard ground. And she could see the years in his face, and she knew he saw them in hers, and neither of them had ever made the mistake of pretending that time was anything other than what it was. It already is, he said. Bigger than us? Has been for years. She looked back at the stream. He was right. She knew he was right. Haven Ridge was already being talked about in territories she'd never traveled. Women coming from distances she could not have imagined when Sarah had walked out of the trees with a child on her hip and not much else. Letters arrived weekly. Willow wrote from the east that the women at her school had heard of the place and wanted to know more. It had gotten out of their hands in the best possible way, which is to say it had become a thing that lived on its own terms now, and all she and Garrick had done was start it and refuse to stop. She had not saved herself on that platform in Red Ash Crossing. That was a thing worth saying clearly. She had not saved herself because she had been in the kind of situation that a person cannot save themselves from alone, and the help she'd gotten from a man who stopped because he couldn't stand to keep walking, that help had mattered. That help had been the difference. But she had done the rest. Every day after that, the trust she'd built slowly and refused to extend before she was ready. The work she'd done on this mountain through cold and pregnancy and fear and grief. The choosing she'd done when choosing became possible. The building she'd done when she could have just stayed in the safety of what was already built. That was hers. Nobody had done that for her. Nobody could have. The victory was not over her father. He had been dead for years, and he had not had the decency to become less himself before he died. And the final apology that had been embedded in a legal document was not what she would have written if she'd been writing the ending. But you didn't get to write the ending for other people. You only got to write your own, and she had written hers in the work of 30 years and a community of women and children who had each found their own way forward from the worst thing they'd been handed. That was not a small thing. She sat with Garrick on the rock until the coffee was cold and the morning was fully awake, and then they walked back up the slope together, not quickly, in the unhurried way of people who know where they are going and are not afraid of what they'll find when they get there. Behind them, Haven Ridge was waking. The smell of wood smoke from the cookhouse. The sound of children, which was the sound that meant more than anything else, because it meant the next part had already started. The sound of someone laughing. Sarah, probably, who had turned out to have a laugh that could be heard across a clearing and had used it freely for 20 years, which was itself a kind of proof. Maris Holloway Voss walked back into the life she had built and did not look behind her. Not because the past wasn't there. It was there. It would always be there, the rope, the platform, the weather vane, the sound of the crowd. Those things did not go away, and she had stopped expecting them to, but they were behind her, and everything she had chosen was ahead. And that in the end was the whole of it. Not that the damage hadn't happened, not that the hard things hadn't been hard, but that she had found, on the other side of all of it, that she was still someone who could choose, still someone who could build, still someone who could hold open a door for the next person who needed to come through it. Some wounds close, some don't. The ones that don't, you learn to carry without letting them steer. She had learned that. She had learned it the hard way, which is the only real way it gets learned. And she had passed it on. That was enough. That was in fact everything.